I want to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sabrina Helm, and she is the PetSmart Associate Professor of Retailing and Consumer Sciences here in the Norton School. She also directs the Consumers, Environment, and Sustainability Initiative at the University of Arizona. She received her PhD in Business Administration from the University of Dusseldorf in Germany, and you'll recognize that when she starts speaking. Really? Prior to coming to Tucson, she was Professor of Strategic Marketing in Witten-Herdecke University, Germany. Did I butcher it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. In her research, she focuses on customer management, corporate reputations, and sustainable consumption. In the later domain, she is particularly interested in the concept of mindfulness in the context of consumer behavior, as well as the role of consumption in the context of climate change. Her research has been published in Journal of Marketing, Journal of Service Research, British Journal of Management, Journal of Business Research, and European Journal of Marketing, among others. And one thing she didn't write about in her bio was that she's the mommy of a new little boy named Jake. So,
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, and welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to talk about one of my favorite research subjects currently. When I was preparing this talk, I was thinking about which direction this could go, because for many of you, researching consumer behavior is maybe not what you are confronted with on a usual basis every day. So we'll see how this fits and where this can lead us. I will also present some studies we have conducted which are more exploratory, and it's all work in progress. Yeah. So I would be very happy if we can discuss some of your ideas of where this could eventually head. Whoops. Oh, should I be presenting a bit more about the speaker series as well? Where is my talk?
You should be able to exit out of that one, and yours should be back.
There we are. All right. So, consumer mindfulness as a pathway to decrease overconsumption. It's going to take different kinds of directions, as you will see. We'll talk about what mindfulness means in general, but I'm going to preface it by pointing out a little bit more about that challenge of overconsumption that is very relevant to my research work. And as you heard Dr. Hawley explain, I'm looking at it in different kind of angles, also for instance in the context of climate change and consumer behavior. And then we'll take a look at what mindfulness actually may mean in this context. And then I'll introduce two different studies that we conducted and talk a bit about a couple of implications. So first off, overconsumption is truly an issue. Very relevant, obviously, on an individual level. Yeah, if you think about how overconsumption can have health effects, if you think in the context of obesity, for instance, but also psychological effects when we look at compulsive consumption, for instance, financial pressures that result from consuming too much, spending too much. So on the individual level, there's certainly some evidence that overconsumption poses a problem. But there is also the bigger picture. Yeah, we live on a planet with finite resources. We can try to travel to Mars, but it's going to be a while. Yeah, and so currently we are stuck with this one planet. And if all consumers consumed on the level of us Americans, or you Americans, us living in this country, we need 5 planets right now. The resources of 5 planets right now. Tough. Yeah, so we have to tackle the issue from several perspectives, and so my interest is, of course, what drives this overconsumption, and are there ways maybe to mitigate that? Yeah, and the reasons why people overconsume are fairly obvious, particularly in our American consumer culture. It is just part of the way of life. Yeah. It's really ingrained in a lot of what we call cultural rituals, because they are associated with a lot of consumption. Consumption has to do with status, and it's also something that we simply habitually do and don't pay much attention to. And this is where I'm heading towards this issue of mindfulness. And some researchers have called it really a social pathology. It's a big, big problem for society, for individuals, for society, and for the planet as a whole. And in order to curb overconsumption, it's really a question of how we can change lifestyles. So it's really an overarching challenge that we are facing, and it's not so much about changing individual patterns of consumption in particular issues or domains of consumption. It's really more about lifestyle changes. And there's the problem is that a lot of consumption, as I said, is driven by habits. We don't think about it. And so there's a lot of room for psychological research trying to tackle how we can transition to more sustainable lifestyles. And some of the pictures I have here, so this is of course California. So you have big drought, big problems, but people still use a lot of water and irrigate lawns and all sorts of plant material that's requiring water. And then of course with regard to children, we face a lot of issues. So that's sort of the preface of what my general concern is when I look at my research and my research agenda. It's like really trying to tackle these kind of questions. So now what does mindfulness have to do with that? And what does it mean in the context of consumer behavior research and overconsumption? And with that, I ask you, what is mindfulness? See the same faces I see with my undergraduate students.
It's being mindful of what you're doing at the present moment. And so in terms of consumption, you would be mindful of like whether or not you need it, and
you would actually think about it, right?
Right.
Yes.
I think it's also being present. Because how many times do we drive to work and go, oh, how'd that get here? Just get to work.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's being present.
Yep.
So digging a little bit deeper to make the unconscious conscious. So it's that being present in the moment requires realizing that you want it to begin with, like you realizing it and then making the unconscious conscious.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, very good. That worked. Yeah. So there's obviously very many different perspectives on this phenomenon of mindfulness. Yeah. So very simple definitions here. It's a mode of consciousness capability that people may have to more or less extent. It's about keeping one's consciousness alive to present reality. So that's a strong element of it. It's about this present moment awareness and really paying attention to what is going on right now. Right now. And what's a bit of a challenge when you're talking about mindfulness is that very often we use it in everyday language, sort of like we got to be mindful of, and then something comes. We got to be mindful of what we're eating. But then generally we're thinking about what we should be doing or have a plan for the future or think about the past, and that's not what this concept of mindfulness in this academic or research context means. Because that is strictly what is going on right now, not thinking about something else and being aware of potential problems and thinking them through. It's about right now. I'm holding this. I'm standing here. I'm breathing, paying attention to that. I see all of you. I see what you're doing right now. And I'm currently not thinking about what's happening next weekend. So trying to blank all of that and just focus on right now. So that's the essence of what mindfulness means. And I love this picture. You probably have seen that, and particularly if you heard any of my presentations. And that's just it. We are the ones with the cluttered brain. There's always something going on, right? And you're sitting here, but you're probably thinking about going somewhere tonight, or all the stuff that's on your desk and all that. So that's who most of us are. We just continuously have a cluttered mind. If you have a dog or a cat, they don't have that problem. For them, it's enjoying the presence. Everything is about now. And if you have a dog, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's about now I need a treat. Now I want to go out. I'm so happy. Yeah, and I don't even remember that you were gone for 15 minutes. And now is great. And that's the difference, because we tend to think. Yeah, so that can in certain instances also be a drawback, I guess. Yeah, so that's like the simplest understanding, but of course it gets a bit more complicated in an academic context. So mindfulness has been defined as a trait, as a state, as a process, and it has been approached from two different angles or cultural viewpoints. Also in historical view of how research has developed in that regard. Yeah, there's the Eastern meditation-based approach, and there's what's been generally called the socio-cognitive approach. Yeah. The Eastern Buddhist view is this focus on the present inner experience. If any of you meditate, then that's what you're usually supposed to focus on. As things that you're shutting out your mind with respect to the external environment, and you do not notice stimuli in the external environment. You do not hear sounds, voices. You shut all of that out. You're just focusing on the inner self. Yeah. The socio-cognitive view is somewhat different. It also includes stimuli from the outside. There is an external world to that. It's a cognitive psychological phenomenon. Yeah. So two different views. And I go into a bit more detail here because it's really important, because there are so many different research approaches with regard to mindfulness that may go into one of these two different directions, or maybe even a third. So these contemplative or meditation-based approaches to mindfulness, the Eastern Buddhist view, yeah, their mindfulness means cultivation of non-judgmental awareness of one's present inner reality and experience. Yeah, and cultivation already shows that usually there's a long-term practice involved with actually achieving mindfulness in the context of these contemplative approaches. So if you don't have meditation experience, you can't just decide, okay, now I'm going to be mindful here for a moment. That's not how that works. Yeah? So there's a whole, there's an effort for learning until you get to a certain state of mindfulness. And it's associated with certain attitudes like gratitude, generosity, compassion, and empathy, which are qualities and characteristics of people who are more mindful in the Buddhist context. Yeah, and so that's it's. I would classify it even as a sort of like a worldview of how we look at what's going on and how we as humans can play a role in the greater context of what's happening. The mindfulness in this context can be learned, it can be practiced, of course, but usually it's long-term meditation practice. There's many different approaches that can focus on mindfulness in this particular context, such as, for instance, mindfulness-based stress reduction. You may have participated in these kinds of trainings. U of A actually has a compassion research center that focuses on particularly these kinds of mindfulness. And then there's a socio-cognitive approach. Yeah, it's mostly associated with Harvard professor Ellen Langer, who has conducted research over decades with regard to socio-cognitive mindfulness. And her viewpoint is more let's build it up from the ground. Let's think about its opposite, and that's mindlessness. And many of us tend to be mindless a lot of time. Yeah, we think about, for instance, we drive from A to B, and sometimes we arrive at B and we're like, I don't even remember which road I took or what happened and what I saw and were there other cars, what was going on? Yeah, was the light red or yellow or what? I don't even remember because we focus on something else. We are just, something else is going on, and so that's more mindless. Yeah, we mindlessly pursue activities. And we do that with a lot of activities in our daily life because our daily life is really cluttered with the need for different activities. We cannot or do not want to pay detailed attention to all of them. So some of it just takes place habitually. Habitually is associated with mindlessly. We don't think about it. Whereas mindfulness is characterized by openness to what's currently going on, but also openness to new experiences, to perceiving something that's different. And so socio-cognitive mindfulness in the context of Langner's study denote a general style or mode of functioning. And so there's active, mindful engagement, with what's going on outside, not the inner reality, outside, what's going on there. Paying attention to that, drawing conclusions that enable us to change what we think and then also how we behave. So it's and Langner details it as having 4 different kinds of facets. It's about being open to novelty seeking, being flexible, accepting viewpoints of others, for instance, taking different perspectives to understand the phenomenon, being engaged not just in the present moment, but also what shapes it, and also having the ability to generate new ideas, novel solutions, and not just being stuck with what we already know and just simply doing that again and again and again. And Sternberg has tried to make it a bit simpler and simply says it's a cognitive style. It's sort of on the boundary of what describes people as in their personality and how they function cognitively. So it's in between those constructs. No matter whether we see it as sort of like a personality trait or a cognitive feature, by systematic practice we can also increase this kind of mindfulness. It does also. So it can change over time, and we have it sort of in our hand to actually change it. For instance, by pursuing certain creative mental tasks and training our mind to become more mindful. But both approaches, Eastern Buddhist as well as socio-cognitive, agree on certain aspects. So all people are more or less mindful. So it's degrees of mindfulness, and generally mindfulness has beneficial outcomes for individual, and there have been studies showing that in all sorts of different domains, starting from learning, behavioral regulation, becoming more creative, all the way down to well-being and actually longevity. There's exciting studies conducted by Langner that show that people actually live longer when they, and better actually in a positive way, longer if they become more mindful. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, and you see from these kind of outcome variables that have been studied, and there are many more, that there's all sorts of academic disciplines that look at mindfulness. Interestingly, very few from my standpoint, and from moving on from here, I am no longer looking at the Buddhist approach. No more Buddha. This is all going to be focused on Langner's socio-cognitive approach. So my research interest is how does mindfulness in the socio-cognitive understanding affect consumption behaviors, particularly overconsumption-related behaviors and sustainable consumption behaviors. And the general assumption behind that is if an individual is more mindful, they should be more aware of the consequences of their behavior, and they should also be more able and open to change their current behavioral patterns compared to people who are less mindful. That's a general assumption we have if you think about what differentiates more mindful people from less mindful ones. And there have been a little bit of studies, or a couple of studies conducted in the context of consumption and mindfulness, although not necessarily my or Langner's interpretation of mindfulness. So we know that more mindful individuals tend to be less materialistic. With regard to buying products, they tend to be more environmentally responsible but that study that has been conducted there was more in that meditation-based realm. And we also know that it can affect food selection behaviors, healthy eating among students. There has been an interesting study conducted there. So what I've been looking at was the context of sustainable consumption, overconsumption, and I did that in collaboration with my former graduate student, Brinta, and I also want to recognize her because a lot of this was her effort that brought me here today, if you will. So sustainable consumption, of course, means consumption that leaves resources over for the next generations. And by our consumption, we can obviously have an effect on that. and we can think about consumption or consumption patterns that really affect what we buy in the supermarket, for instance, every day. Do we select, for instance, the green brands versus the non-green brands? But other facets of sustainable consumption would be: do we buy at all? Yeah. Or do we think about, can we share product with others, and so we don't have to buy it all? Or maybe we can repair products we have at home instead of always buying new. So there's really a broad variety of behaviors that can fall in this category of sustainable consumption. Yeah? From whether I commute to work, whether I take the plane, when I fly on vacation, all the way to, as I said, the different products that I buy. There's a lot out there: energy, behavior, water consumption, etc., etc. In the context of my study, I looked at the kind of products that people buy. Are they more or less green? Do they come from companies that are perceived as having a high level of corporate social responsibility? Yeah? Do also these companies express an interest in sustainability? And then there's a phenomenon called voluntary simplicity. So there are groups of people who voluntarily decrease their consumption levels. They scale down. They live in smaller houses. They are interested in having a smaller footprint in life. And that's actually a lifestyle segment that's growing also in the United States. And I'm looking at two additional variables here, because we don't know whether people who are mindful generally also simply like nature more. Yeah, I mean, there could be different thoughts about that when we talk about people being mindful. Does it simply mean they are good people, for instance, who are also more benign towards negative things that are going on in the world, like pollution, etc.? Are they generally just more caring? So we have to pay attention to some potentially mediating variables. Yeah. And in this study, we looked at environmental concern. Which is a general attitude towards preserving the environment and the value that one has towards having an intact natural environment. And we know that people who have such a value tend to consume more sustainably. So that can be expected, but we don't know how they deal in the context of mindfulness. Yeah. And the other mediating variable that I'm looking at is called perceived consumer effectiveness. That's a self-efficacy measure. Because consumers may think, environmental problems are great, climate change is a huge issue, but I, the little me individual, can't change anything about that. So a person who thinks in that way would have low perceived consumer effectiveness. They feel they can't really make a difference. And we would, of course, think that somebody who's mindful in the socio-cognitive sense would perceive their own role to be an active role, and actually take different kinds of perspectives and feeling enabled to make a change. So those then are our hypotheses for this particular study. Mindfulness is positively associated with these sustainable consumption behaviors, and then there's also these mediating variables that we can pay attention to. So we conducted an online survey on Amazon MTurk. This study, we had 546 participants, and demographically they came fairly close to US Census data, skewing just a little bit low on income, but other than that they were fairly representative. And maybe one note here on how we measure mindfulness in the socio-cognitive sense. Langer has developed a scale which we used in this context that relates to these 4 different facets of mindfulness. To call it an established scale is an understatement, because it's been used in so many different studies, but not in our context. Yeah, a lot of the mindfulness-related studies have been conducted in clinical settings, and not so much with the general population. So this is then the scale that we have employed, and here is our model, and what we see, and we can actually see that probably a bit better here in this table of the direct and indirect effects. We see, as hypothesized, what we expected, with the exception of voluntary simplicity, which is apparently not significantly affected by mindfulness, which is a bit of a surprise for us. Because if you think about these people, who scale down and seem to be very conscious in terms of what consumption may mean and what the negative impacts might be, you would think that they would skew higher on mindfulness, but then we did not see that. Yeah. But overall, there is apparently some sense that mindfulness seems to be positively correlated with being more environmentally concerned, feeling more enabled to make a change in that particular context and to more sustainably consume. Okay, so that's fine, but then we still need to figure out, what's the causality here? We still don't know whether people who are more mindful simply are more benign, and they are just the people who simply care more about the environment, for instance. Yeah. So in the next iteration, what we want to do, and here's the work in progress piece, is to conduct experiments, and we have started out with those. We're trying to manipulate or elicit environmental concern and perceived consumer effectiveness to then see how that plays out in the context with mindfulness. Yeah? To maybe see whether people who don't have reason to be environmentally concerned still exhibit stronger propensity for sustainable consumption behaviors. Unfortunately, we are like in the third or fourth iteration of trying to get this manipulation down, and it just somehow doesn't work. So if anybody has an idea how we can better manipulate or elicit these kinds of variables, namely environmental concern, I'd be so happy. Yeah, it's so hard. So far hasn't really worked out, but we're getting there. Second study then, that sort of like builds on this. Okay, to assume that there's an affinity between sustainability and mindfulness seems rather close. So we wanted to go away from that for one step and say, well, how about general overconsumption then? Yeah? Are these mindful consumers also more likely to generally consume less or show less overconsumption behaviors? And we also actually wanted to know, is there a difference between people who meditate and who don't meditate? That data is still sitting there. I will talk about that next time, because we think there may just be some differences in there. But what I can show you now is overconsumption in two different facets here that we looked at in this study. There's compulsive consumption. Yeah, that is really an excessive form of, or an urge to buy products, and actually facing negative consequences because of that, maybe in financial terms, maybe in terms of psychological pressure that people feel because they consume just too much. So compulsive consumption has been studied in marketing literature and consumer behavior literature quite extensively, but not in that particular context. And then overshopping. All of us overshop. Yeah? If you look in your fridge, take a critical view into that, opening the door, there's a lot in there. You can look at it right now and say, you're not going to survive. Nobody's going to eat you. Yeah? But I'm keeping you here for a little longer because I feel bad throwing you out. Right? But we do that. Yeah? We buy too much because we buy in bulk. We want a better price. We are just enticed by point of sales things that are going on, and we just overbuy. So it's a very simple example. We are all prone to do that. And this is what this variable is about, and particularly in the grocery context, because it's so obvious and because it has such large consequences. Just as a side note, 25% of the water used, the fresh water used in the United States, is used to grow produce that then gets discarded. A quarter of our water supply. So if we could cut down on that, we'd be happier, right? We would not have to travel to Mars maybe at some point. So this is a huge issue. So that's the one aspect of the study. And then we wanted to see, okay, let's replicate the sustainability aspect as well, because the opposite of overconsumption is not consuming. Yeah? So we also included a variable which we called purchase avoidance, people who repair product instead of buying new, for instance. Yeah? So to include that facet, and sharing products with others instead of owning them yourself. So we cover all of that, and have a set of new mediators in this particular study. Self-efficacy this time, spending self-control. Yeah? Is an individual good at keeping tabs on their finances, yeah? And buying impulsiveness. There's a proneness in some consumers to decide on the spot in the store environment, oh yeah, I really want that, I really need that. Actually, they don't, but it's an urge to buy at the point of sale, and so we think that may also have to do with overconsumption. Another online MTurk survey, 965 this time. Again, socio-demographic variables somewhat close to US Census data. Another nice and colorful model, which I summarize here. So we replicate pretty much with that, again, this notion that mindfulness is positively associated with sustainable consumption behaviors because we have a positive effect of mindfulness on purchase avoidance and on sharing. Yeah? But not on these everyday kind of consumer behaviors. And that was very disheartening for us because we would have been very happy to see that more mindful individuals also tend to overshop less. Because that would have such a big impact. If you could, change mindfulness a little bit, you would potentially have a big effect on these kind of over shopping behaviors, which are just so detrimental in the context of economic decline and climate change. But unfortunately, we did not see that. Only once we integrate our mediators, particularly spending self-control and also buying impulsiveness. So if you should be an impulsive buyer, if you would self-identify as such, you are unlikely to be particularly mindful. If you score high on spending self-control, then there is high likelihood that you're also more mindful. But overall, we were a bit discouraged by this finding because it would have been much nicer, cooler for us. So mindfulness as a socio-cognitive mode does have direct impact on sustainable consumption behavior. So there's some evidence that is something we can pursue in the future with sufficient certainty, but no direct effect of compulsive consumption and overspending, over shopping, and that's for us. It's an indication that mindfulness alone is not enough, not strong enough to override these automatic, habitualized shopping patterns that we have been socialized to exhibit for many, many years. We learned certain behaviors in the shopping context which are so hard to break. You have your product loyalties, you have certain habits in everyday consumption. It starts from when you get up and you take a shower and you make breakfast and all that. If you think about every time you use resources like water, like energy and all that, you do it really subconsciously, unconsciously. And being more mindful in this context apparently is not enough to get across that. So probably if we wanted interventions to really break that up, they need to be stronger in order to really change these kinds of routines. Self-efficacy, although many studies show there's a positive effect of mindfulness on self-efficacy, it wasn't associated with our consumption variables, so that's not the thing. But spending self-control, and that's much closer related to consumer behavior, so it makes sense that there's an effect, had an effect there. So we think that financial decision-making and mindfulness would be an interesting topic to pursue. Because financial decision-making tends to be very cognitively involved, even if a lot of people don't want to do that, but once they sit down and do that, then there is cognitive involvement, and then mindfulness could actually play a role. And buying impulsiveness, as is pretty obvious, also plays a role. So what does all of that mean here? So for consumers in general, and also for, if you will, the planet as a whole, it is wonderful to know that mindfulness is positively associated with sustainable consumption behaviors. Because if we can change the level of mindfulness, maybe in certain populations, maybe in certain decision-making contexts, more sustainable behavioral patterns may result. That's overall encouraging. And in general, I have yet to find a study that says mindfulness is bad for people, that there are any negative outcomes. Whenever I talk about this with my students or in any kind of context, and I always say, somebody should conduct the study of the mindfulness mass murderer. Yeah, because mindfulness in and of itself doesn't mean you're good or bad. It just means you have a certain cognitive style. So there may be very mindful mass murderers out there, but obviously the consequences of such behavior are horrific. Yeah? So I wonder whether there are other contexts where mindfulness can be detrimental, maybe not just for the individual, but maybe also in the greater context. I haven't seen any research in that area. Not that I would want to conduct it, but I'm a bit skeptic with regard of saying, mindfulness is just this savior kind of concept. But mindfulness can be trained, and in the context of sustainable consumption patterns, that's certainly helpful. However, there's also some other aspects with regard to research in particular that we might pay attention to. So looking at my and Brinta in my studies, we still really need to tease out what consumption scenarios may be open for mindfulness interventions and which not so much. Sustainability, okay, but then why not some of the others? So maybe we can tease that out better. And what we also see is there are people who score high on mindfulness, and once they hit the grocery store, they shop by the bagful and shop till they drop, it appears. How can that be? What's going on there? What changes in these different life scenarios that sometimes we are able to exhibit mindfulness in everyday decision making and sometimes not? So that's something is bothering me. You need to figure that out. Yeah. We need to figure out also in the context of research how can we elicit mindfulness in an experimental context, to better understand its consequences. Langer has conducted these kind of experimental studies by using cognitive tests and word puzzles and all sorts of things that get our attention to focus on the current moment and be more cognitively involved, and that had positive consequences. But in our behavior context, we haven't really seen any studies nor conducted any of those. And then, even if mindfulness would be this cure for a lot of bad behaviors, it's still in competition to some other ways to effect such behavioral change. In consumer behavior context, we talk a lot about social norm messaging, for instance. Pointing out how others behave helps shaping my own behavior. And so would that be stronger as an intervention compared, for instance, to increasing mindfulness? Because we also have to think about what's more efficient. There are apps available. Some of you may play around with those. How you can train mindfulness in everyday context. Maybe we also need to understand a bit more about those. But then there's yet another layer with regard to mindfulness in the research context. Mindfulness apparently somehow affects decision making, our information processing on the cognitive level, but we don't know much about that and how and why and how that works. How is mindfulness really related to decision making? Don't know. I'm not aware of studies. And then we also say that more mindful people are resistant to persuasive attempts from the outside because they are just more aware of attempts to be manipulated. Well, in a research context, that can backfire, right? Because in experiments, for instance, we try to manipulate our respondents. But what if those who are mindful already react differently to our manipulations just because they are mindful? So that would sort of create havoc in my experimental design. Nobody's looked at that. It makes me wonder what's going on there. And so are there maybe other ways to deal with that? And then finally, FSHD. Why would anybody of you potentially be interested in mindfulness and mindfulness-related studies? You know that much better than me, but some ideas that I had was, financial decision-making in households is a big deal. And if that is affected positively by increased mindfulness, that would be very, very important to show and find out. I think about parenting a lot. Wonder why. How does mindfulness of the parent, for instance, help different parenting styles, and how does it also help in the context of family relationships? And then the question that I for some reason have is, how does nature exposure and mindfulness relate to each other? Are they sort of like the same things? Can we really reach the same positive aspects or outcomes? Yeah. For instance, if children are exposed to nature, we know that has positive consequences for them. Could we reach similar consequences by exposure to mindfulness? That's it for me currently. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions that you have.
I wonder if mindfulness can be manipulated. Have you thought about whether it could vacillate over a time period? For
Yeah.
example, people who have high levels of stress, if they're very stressed out, they can't make responsible decisions that benefit the environment. They're just thinking about surviving.
Yeah. Very likely that would be a very important mediator to have in there to see, currently, if you think about your present moment conditions, are you particularly stressed out or not? So we were of course thinking about these saliva experiments, to try and figure out, can you stress out people in the moment and see a difference in mindfulness? But I'm also still trying to figure out how can I then actually measure mindfulness in that kind of a context, because using a simple Langner scale might not be the most interesting thing in that context. So I also need a solution then for actually dealing with mindfulness in that context. Because you could see, well, maybe there's different kinds of decision making that resulting in
Right.
these situations.
Like, oh, I had a bad day. I'm just going to eat this whole pint of ice cream.
Yes.
One of the things I was thinking about, I don't know if this is mindfulness, but I think about myself, I think I'm a fairly mindful consumer, but there's often conflicts in what I'm considering. And so, for example, the more environmentally friendly product, I'd like to buy that, but it's more expensive. And so it seems like there might be competing concerns around like how thrifty you are versus how much you value sort of environmentally friendly products.
Yes, and that's really, really interesting. We were wondering, if you try to be a good, sustainable consumer, you are confronted with all sorts of bad choices. It's not just the product quality versus price issue. It's also, typical example from parenting, disposable diapers or not, right? And generally, as environmentally conscious consumers, I should not use disposable diapers. However, now I live in the state of Arizona. We don't have water. So if I start washing all these reusable diapers all the time, I use all this water. Is that actually worse? So here I am, not making potentially the sustainable decision. Although I was very cognitively involved and maybe I am also a mindful consumer and have a higher level of mindfulness. I never measured that in comparison to others. But I'm sort of like hung up. And being mindful first, and again, simply means that I pay attention to the consequences of my behavior, but I can knowingly decide against a particular green decision. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So that's why understanding what mindfulness means in this information processing and decision-making context would be so important in any kind of decision-making context. To really understand what this construct then means.
I was just thinking about looking at regions and policies in those regions that help with sustainable behaviors, because where I come from in Atlanta, it was harder to recycle. And now I'm here and I feel more efficacious with recycling here in Tucson than I did there. So I was kind of thinking how this is salient with withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement and how cities are taking on their own initiatives and how that can help the people in those areas feel more like they're more able to do something. And so I was thinking like maybe if there was a regional difference in like maybe policies that make something like that easier.
Yeah, I know from the literature is that particularly if you look at recycling related behaviors that you always need to control for what kinds of systems a consumer is living within, because those restrictions then really drive your behavior to that's like probably the best explaining factor in it. Yeah. If you have no access to recycling containers, if there's no curbside recycling, it just takes so much more effort to be a green consumer that it's less likely that it's happening. Yeah, absolutely.
So I was interested in the over shopping piece of it, and it's interesting that those findings didn't quite come out. So I had a few thoughts about that. One is, have you looked at things like anxiety and depression as also potential mediator moderators? Because it seems like those kind of things potentially would be linked with the more pathological behaviors like the over shopping.
Yeah.
And mindfulness might be a way to kind of reduce anxiety or reduce depression that may then, lead to the kind of behaviors you want to see.
I agree that it's likely another mediator that would be very important to understand in that context. I agree. This is not my background. I'm reluctant to integrate these kinds of variables, but yeah, I fully agree.
So I'd be happy to talk with you about those kind of variables, because we've worked with that for a while.
Yeah.
But the other thoughts I had were more about the measurement of mindfulness, and what, how that may be factoring in. So one thing was, maybe if they're more mindful, are they then also more, are they giving different self-report responses? So if you're less mindful about your behavior, you're more likely to say, oh, I'm not doing this as much. And if you're more mindful, you may actually be doing less of it, but you're more aware of what you're doing, so you may rate yourself higher. So there's some issues with the self-report that could be addressed with different kind of methods in getting at the outcomes that you want.
Yeah, and that's one of these thoughts also. We were wondering about that because, again, somebody who is maybe more mindful may be very critical of their own attempts. Yeah? And that means they will probably comparatively underreport certain behaviors because they feel they not do enough in the context of the big problem. And this is exactly this kind of methodological problems we run into. This is why we would like to create an experimental design that takes all of that out. Yeah. And then on the other hand, really also understand how mindfulness can be best measured for research purposes, because we run into all these kinds of issues. If somebody is more cognitively there, if you will, they figure out how the survey works. Yeah.
Well, the other thing I was thinking is if if you're sticking with the Langer perspective and the socio-cognitive and using that measure, if part of that is saying I'm open to novelty, are some of those people potentially more susceptible to the advertisements when they're in the moment of shopping, because they're very present in the store and they're very open to new things and they're like, oh wait, I do need that new pair of shoes. I do need that new whatever it is. So I wonder if because you're using that particular measure, if that is overly correlated with the outcome that you want.
It could. Because if we also looked in one of our studies, we looked at the association between mindfulness materialism and overconsumption behaviors, and we see that mindfulness is negatively associated with materialism, but we still see overconsumption. Yeah, so we're like wondering, then you need to look into what do they actually buy, and it may be exactly this, because there are like technological innovations. If the new iPhone comes out, or whatever, these may be the people who are really into innovative products, and therefore they do consume, but they're still really mindful. So this is maybe what's going on. There would not be compulsive consumption, but it would generally be, I buy the newest stuff and I want to have it, I want to own it.
Well, anyways, really interesting presentation, and you did a really good job at making it relevant to those of us in family study, explaining the different shopping variables. So, that's good. Thank you.
I'm curious to know why you chose to use the socio theory versus maybe certain perspective of mindfulness?
Several reasons for that, I guess, but the most relevant for me is I want to understand, consumer behavior on a pretty broad level, given that it has a big picture impact on climate change, etc., etc. So, if I look at meditation-based mindfulness, that's really only something that few consumers can exhibit because we don't have that many meditators among us. Yeah, so. While we can potentially learn a lot, if these people really have a big difference in terms of their consumption patterns, and we could somehow emulate that for the broader population, that would be very helpful. But in generally, for me, it was first of more important to understand pretty much everybody, before I focus on a subgroup of these meditators.
That was gonna, because it seems like the way that you're measuring mindfulness might mean something different in a Western context.
Yes.
An East Asian perspective
Yes.
of Buddhism.
Yes.
Maybe potentially redefining what mindfulness means in the Western context. And
Yeah.
the individual characteristics that you may find in somebody that is mindful from an Eastern perspective, since you did say that it's a personality trait, it's a habit, something that the culture is already instilled at a young age.
Yes.
Whereas in Western context, we're very materialistic, and the importance of consumption is everywhere.
Yes.
So the idea of mindfulness in that way, yes, I'm present, but we're also, I don't know, like short gratification
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think maybe redefining mindfulness from an East Asian perspective can give you an understanding of why overconsumption may not be found in other countries.
Yeah.
It's more of a Western problem of overconsumption than
If you go to China, I'm pretty sure you find strong issues.
like the definition of mindfulness within an East Asian.
Yeah. So Langer's concept is called the Western socio-cognitive approach. So very clearly, it applies to. I won't say our, but localize what's going on, particularly in this country and some other highly industrialized nations. Let's just put it that way. Yeah. And I talked to at a conference I was presenting this, and I talked to a lady from Thailand, and she just told me, I don't even know what you're talking about. Yeah, for them or for her, mindfulness had such a different kind of meaning, and it was so clearly centered around the Buddhist notion of what mindfulness means that she had a very hard time relating to what I was talking about. So very clearly, you can't replicate the study simply by translating those items and going to another context. Absolutely not. And we wouldn't want. But our point again is, if we can understand what drives consumption behavior in this country, that is the biggest driver of overconsumption and its negative effects, it's certainly of value. If I understand that in a very small country, it's also very interesting from a research perspective, but not in terms of effecting change. This is why we started here, and that's why we thought we can use the socio-cognitive approach from Langer, because it's been developed in the United States. Yeah. But I'm not making assumptions with regard to what drives overconsumption in other countries right now. They will be different drivers, potentially.
So Sabrina, Europe is Western, but Europe is way ahead of us on, they're much better at sustainability and managing their consumption. I think part of it is about space. Americans have much bigger spaces to live and to move around than the Europeans do. But do you have other senses of why Europeans are better at it?
Well, I mean, if we look at spending in general, the Europeans aren't much better. They exhibit more sustainable consumption behaviors, yes. But if you look at their overall spending, it's nearly as bad as it is here.
So it's not about spending, it's about the amount that they spend.
Yeah.
That they buy.
Yeah.
I mean, they might
Yeah,
buy
it's-
one beautiful merino wool sweater instead of 6 at $6.98.
Yes, yes, yes. So if you look at, also if you look at the actual impacts on climate change, Germany, Great Britain, they're really bad too. Despite, I would also think that probably in the general consciousness, being sustainable plays a more dominant role in maybe a German mindset than in an American. So that may be, but then again, we also have to look at the different kinds of environments. Yeah? When I grew up in Germany, recycling was ingrained in me day one, and we have the infrastructure on the street, and this is where you put the green glass bottle, and this is where you put the the brown glass bottle, and you do that, and you also put in a lot of effort, because everybody does, and there's very strong social norms. Those don't exist in this country, and we cannot sort of like bash this country because it's less sustainable. It's because the socialization processes and all that very, very, very different. Yeah. And as you say, I live out there in the desert. I am not being sustainable at all, because I have to drive every day to work. Otherwise, I have no way of getting here. I can't even bike. It's too hot and it's not safe. So, it's a huge country. You can't build this exactly same infrastructure that maybe has less of a climate impact. You just replicate that here. It's just not that simple.
houses with closets the size of bedrooms.
Well, I mean, there is that, of course. I mean, there's plenty of room for improvement,
I just have a question about the research that might go into the fact of the component, rather than just even the overconsumption, but the responsibility within the corporations, how their production is not, sustainable for the climate that's going on right now, and this sort of blame that's being put on the consumer when I could maybe still consume the amount that I'm consuming, but if it's made in a better way, and like, is there research that's pointed at that, saying these big corporations might need to actually take more responsibility before the consumer does?
It's very difficult because in economics there is I don't want to call it a trend. It's a small movement called degrowth. Yeah, how can we create an economy that's not driven by growth goals, but actually can shrink in terms of GDP and all that, and still let us all flourish within the workforce, etc. Because of course, I mean, I work in the retailing program, right? So for me to talk about sustainable consumption and decreasing consumption is a problem. Yeah, the business models of retailers, of many companies, require growth. The whole structure requires growth. That means selling more stuff. The alternative is, of course, don't sell more stuff, sell better stuff as a higher price, because you need to account for consumers not replenishing as frequently. If you if you think about how often people replace their iPhone, is that really necessary? Well, what does it mean necessary? The older version still functions, but I already replaced. Why do I do that? That's partly driven by companies, and partly it's driven by our ingrained consumer culture. So, and I don't think, this is not about, who puts blame or on anybody else, because the solution to this big issue can only come if all sides cooperate. Consumers, if they decrease consumption and all of a sudden don't buy the stuff anymore that they find in the retailer shelves, easy solution. They will have to change their assortment and potentially their business model. But that's not how this works, right? And so it can happen from both sides. And we will see certain developments, like now we talk about the sharing economy, for instance, and collaborative forms of consumption. And one goal of these sort of like consumption communities is to decrease resources. If I share a car with some other people instead of buying my own, that has an immediate impact on the environment. It also has an immediate impact on the bottom line of the GMs of the world. So it's very difficult, but whatever is simple, right?
So given all that context in your work, where do you think is the point where we focus right now? What is the behavior that we're most likely to be able to create change with the consumers?
In terms of increasing more mindfulness, or in general?
In terms of, the overconsumption in general, I guess.
in terms of what, for instance, impacts are on climate change, it would probably be transportation behaviors, transportation-related behaviors, and food-related behaviors. Yeah, those are very large drivers for this kind of over-shopping and needing more resources than at the end we have. So those would be big, very big ones to tackle.
Time becomes a variable in all of that. Because I don't want to go to the grocery store more than once a week. And then I go to the grocery store and I come back and I look at my calendar for the next week and I've got 5 dinners out and 3 lunches, and it's like I don't need food in my house because everybody else is bought food.
Yeah.
So it's that head of broccoli doing leave it in my refrigerator for another week.
Yeah, but I mean,
Anymore jello.
there's also a lot changing, for instance, in the retail environment. If you look at how, for instance, grocery markets now all of a sudden need to change because Amazon is swooping in there, right? So now you get a home delivery, you get these prep meal, like Blue Apron and all that, and so you see there's something going on because consumer behavior is changing. And at some point, we'll probably have more people who, for instance, feel bad about eating beef. So they want alternatives, and they see there's just this giant impact on the environment that we just can't sustain. So behavior will change, and options how consumers get product are going to be changing. But then again, it's about weighing the impacts. Okay, I don't drive to the supermarket, but somebody else drives to my house. So what's really from an environmental standpoint, what's really better? Those of us who are very mindful about that will probably figure it out and think about it. It's difficult. It's very inconvenient to be a consumer who tries to be more sustainable. It really takes a lot of work and time and feeling bad about it and feeling your limits, and that's why Melissa here and some others are researching eco-anxiety, right? People feeling really pressured in this context of what's our role here in the greater context of climate change. How's that going to affect us? What can we do about it? People get stressed out.
I always thought it would be interesting to explore whether companies who are publicly traded versus privately held companies have a different approach to it, because all the publicly traded have to, they answer to their shareholders first, and they have to keep inching that share up all the time, which means more sales. Whereas Patagonia, Eileen Fisher, these companies are highly held, and they're doing more things that are sustainable.
It's probably why Patagonia has the luxury to be a driver of decreasing consumption. They advertise with "Don't shop," don't buy our stuff, rent it, repair it. It has a long lifetime. Keep it and love it, or share it with others, but do not buy new stuff. What company can actually advertise in that manner and trying to decrease their sales? And the skeptics, of course, will say, well, that's also only another method to drive Patagonia's sales, because now all we green people love the brand, we're going to buy more of it. Yes, it's a convoluted field. It's also really interesting. It has another depth.
It's very interesting. This is great. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Anybody has any questions, please let me know. I'm sitting right here on the 4th floor, right?